Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Jude Moore. I am currently a visiting fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. Before that, I was head of the President's Delivery Unit in Liberia, Deputy Chief of Staff to the President, and later Minister of Works, Minister of Infrastructure. Now, my focus is on financing African infrastructure, and it's almost impossible to write about financing African infrastructure and not write about China. So I've been writing a bit about China-Africa relations, but I'm here to introduce two amazing scholars, two amazing women I've actually gotten more acquainted with over the last hour or so. Um, Ching Kwan is a sociologist and also interested in global and comparative issues. She's reading significant works on globalization, political sociology, development, and the platform, her most recent work has been the rise of platform capitalism in terms of Chinese impact on state-capital relations. Her most recent book, and this is a book that has actually informed my own thinking on the topic, is The Specter of a Global China. And so I think you're gonna enjoy her speech, her conversation today. And then next to her is Yun Park. She is also a sociologist by training. We're lucky today, and but she is at at Cary. This is so for me in most of my research. This is one of the places I go to get information. Is the China Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. She's an associate director there. She teaches at Georgetown. Right, that's correct. And fun fact, she lived in Africa for 15 years, and so I think both of these women are just as African as I am. So without much ado, I will turn over now to CK.
Good afternoon, and I'd like to thank Dorothy for including me in this very exciting event. I was telling Yun that this is a Saturday afternoon in LA, nobody will show up, and here we have a whole room full of people. I am going to talk about my research in one particular country, and I hope it can inform us about our discussion of the Belt and Road. Before the Belt and Road, there was going out, for people who remember another key phrase from Beijing. And China in Africa was a very big part of that initiative, going out. And this book, let me find myself, was the result of 6 years of work in Zambia. I'm trained as a sociologist. I'm still a sociologist. And so for me, policy proclamations from Beijing or from whatever capital is just part of reality. I pay more attention to how those policies are realized or not on the ground, subjected to all sorts of social contestations, cultural interpretations, and relationships, and actors, very specific actors. I believe that Belt and Road going out, these are not actorless, agentless processes. These are all dependent on how people relate to each other and fight their interests. So when we want to understand what Belt and Road will become or what China in Africa is all about, we really need to get to the ground level and spend some time not just reading policies, but also really tracking how people on the ground, how investors, how workers, how government officials all relate to each other and how they bargain. And to get behind the scenes is the challenge, maybe not so much for political scientists or policy scholars, but for sociologists, I don't think we can just go to the text, but we have to actually go inside processes of power and in so many different arenas. And so, I can't give you the whole book. The arguments in the whole book, it would take too long. I'm going to focus on one particular argument that that actually resonates and continues some of the discussion we had until this point. So the first thing I want to say is that China in Africa, China going to Africa, has the same kind of impetuses as what we're seeing now, Belt and Road. It has to do with overcapacity, things that we have already mentioned, falling rates of profits. Companies that I study actually mentioned that they are seeing falling rates of profits in China. That's why they have to go out to Africa. Resource bottlenecks. In Zambia, Zambia is Africa's top copper producer, and that's why China has been very active there 15 years ago, before even going out was announced as an official policy, and of course before the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think the reasons why China is expanding outward has a lot of similarities with other great powers in history. And how do we want to describe that kind of expansionist tendency is we can debate, but I think it's very clear, whatever term we use, we understand that these are the impetuses that China has shared with other great powers in contemporary history. But I think we have, and the public discussion about China, whether in Africa or the Belt and Road, has suffered from a very common conflation between China's ambition and aspiration with its actual achievements on the ground. If, for instance, John showed us the plan, China-Pakistan corridor plan, is a plan. And I think what you picked up from the media in the West is that a lot of times you think people just take the plan as if China has already achieved the plan. So that's one point, first point I want to mention. Go to the ground level and see how things actually pan out, and we all often will find a different reality. Another thing I want to get out of the way is this idea of colonialism. I think, based on my research in Zambia, colonialism is not a productive lens. There is no chartered company, like the East India Company. I know it's always being used as a parallel, but it's no chartered company with exclusive trade rights. No military occupation. There is, yes, Djibouti, but it's a surface base. And US has 600 or so military bases around the world. There's no religious missions from China. And most importantly, for sociologists, colonialism often entailed transplant of institutions. And so far, we're not seeing any transplant of institutions from China to Africa, not even the intention. So I don't think colonialism is the framework to study China in Africa. So what kind of framework can we use? Well, I myself had used the lens of capital, because what actually has happened is huge amount of state capital going from China to the rest of the world. And it's different from other kinds of capital, because other kinds of capital these days you'll find in Africa, as I found in Zambia, which, by the way, has been very much globalized and neoliberalized, with lots of foreign investors from all over the world, and China is only one of them. But what is distinctive about the Chinese investment is that a lot of it is state-backed, is coming from state-owned policy banks, or from centrally owned state-owned enterprises. So I called it state capital. And I think this is the unique form of Chinese power. How it works is what this study is about. What are its mechanisms and effects? State capital. So this is the question. Is Chinese state capital different from global private capital, which is the dominant form of capital we find around the world? And I'm going to go very quickly because of time constraint. Capital for me is not a sheer amount of money that some country spent in another country. That's a very quantitative understanding of capital. You can capture it by statistics, but it tells you nothing about what is the effect, how does that capital work. To me, capital is contested relational processes of valorization. And I draw from classical sociology. There are 3 dimensions of capital we need to pay attention to. I only have time to cover one. And the 3 drawing on Marx's logics of accumulation. What does capital want to accumulate? We know the answer for global private capital, but what does state capital from China want to do? What is its interest, basically? And regime of production is, once we know the interest, then how do they set up institutions of production or other productive units to realize those interests? And it involves exploiting workers, controlling workers, managing workers, and other people on the ground. And then the managers. Capital doesn't just flow into a country. Capital, in order to realize its values or increase its values, relies on people, managers, expatriates from China or other parts of the world, and what they do, how they live in Zambia, what kind of relationship do they build with local governments. These are all part of my study of capital. So today I'm going to focus on the first one, the logic of accumulation, to tell you what, how they relate to Zambian government and what do we learn from that kind of relationship. Very different from political scientists and international relations scholars and maybe economists. I was trained as an ethnographer, and so I have to spend time in the country that I study and hang out with people I study. And this was the period 07 to 14. The book came out last year, 17. So it may be dated, my data may be dated, but I hope that the analysis and the theories that I try to build will still apply because I'm generalizing the theoretical logic. I'm not generalizing the empirical features of these cases. I compare, as I just mentioned, Chinese state capital with global private capital in the same country in two sectors. Copper, Zambia is the top copper producer in Africa, and China has allegedly gone on a very serious commodity hunt. And so I think I need a country, a case where I can illustrate and understand the process of that acquisition of commodities. And construction is another key industry where you find lots of Chinese investment, and particularly important is that these are financed by concessional loans, which I consider another form of state capital. And so I spent a lot of time, and basically I was very lucky to cover this period. This is a period where you find resource nationalism very active. That is, Zambians are very sick and tired of being poor despite the rich endowment that nature has given the country. The mines have been previously state-owned, but structural adjustment came, and the World Bank and IMF, of course, forced them to privatize, and that's why China, Brazil, South Africa, India, by the way, own the largest mine now. So there's a huge array of international capital going to Zambia. The copper belt has been neoliberalized, and I was there to see this groundswell of popular sentiment that people call resource nationalism. That is, people are really angry, and politicians, the voters, want the politicians to react, to help stand firm against these foreign investors so that local people can benefit more. And this is a very important part of my story, something that I think we need to look at, the local political situation. And that is going to be a very important factor constraining and shaping, channeling what China can do on the ground. Another important important factor that comes into my the story is the time period I was lucky enough to observe when the financial crisis hit Zambia, how these two different kinds of capital, Chinese state capital and global private capital, reacted to the same global financial economic crisis. So political movement from below, I call it resource nationalism, and the global financial crisis coming from outside, and how these two types of capitals react, and how the government of Zambia reacted to these factors. Just very quickly to give you a sense of, for people who may not know where Zambia is located. I didn't know very well until I started this study, so I can't assume people always know, is Africa a very big landlocked country. This is where I spend a lot of time along the border with Congo. This is a world-class copper deposit, the copper belt, which is actually straddle two countries and was cut up by colonialism. This is a group of the Chinese managers in the Chinese state mine that I study and stay with for several months. By the way, I have to say, tell you one thing. I won't have time to go into detail of my field work. You can ask me later. I was very lucky in another regard, which was in order to study these big companies, these are London-listed companies and state-owned companies from Beijing, I need very good assets. I needed to know how they interacted with the Zambian elite. So I need really powerful people to open doors for me. I didn't get it during the first 3 years of my research, but I lucked out one of my drinking buddies. You have to drink a lot when you're doing fieldwork to get to know people. One of my drinking buddies, he was an opposition politician. And after one election, 2011, he became the vice president of Zambia. And he made good on his promise to me that he would help call up all these CEOs and let me in, and he did. He sent me in as his advisor. So I look Chinese, I'm American, but also I became advisor to the Zambian president. So it was very confusing for people who, who I study. But I spent time, because of his help, I was able to spend time with these people who live with them in the China House, which is a total institution, which I don't have time to go into unless you ask me. So these are the state officials. They are the top managers of the state mine. This is, oops, sorry. This is how I have to spend time underground. So I actually studied down, which is 1,000 meters below ground, and that's how mining was done, copper mines. And oops, the concentrator, just to show you some visual images of the situation there. Okay, the concentrator, see the women? There are women who work there too. The smelter, state-of-the-art smelter in the middle of nowhere. China House is where everybody lives, and I have a whole chapter on how the culture. By the way, these people are extremely controlled. They are workers, they are called managers, but they're actually laborers for state capitalists from China. So we have a very regimented life. Construction, one part of my study is construction, one is copper. So construction, these are the guys who build roads, very young engineers, supervising African workers. Again, Chinese lives very regimented or organized on Chinese construction sites. All eat together, live together, collective dormitories, which, by the way, are totally different from the Western countries and the managers that work for Western companies. But I don't have time to go into that today. If you want, you should read my book. There are lots of description of how lives are different. So my argument in a nutshell, and just to give you some preparation as to what I want to argue. I want to say that, like the Belt and Road, going out was only a vision, a banner, a brand for Chinese state-owned companies and private companies to take with. It's like an advertising campaign that they can go out with and to attract more investments and to have the kind of halo of the state behind it. There's no central command, no central planner in Beijing who design you go to Zambia and this is what you need to do, there's simply not enough people, and the state didn't do it the way many people suspect it does. It is absolutely important to understand local political dynamic if we want to understand what actually is global China. And by that I mean this state capital sounds very powerful, unlimited amounts of resources, state power, diplomatic power. But actually, from my study here, I see lots of limits. Its capacity is not unlimited, is on the other hand quite constrained, and it comes with its own interests, which I'll explain in a minute, which is quite different from global private capital. But it produces uneven results. John was mentioning earlier, which I agree very much, that we need to study these effects on different countries, and maybe we can then compare different countries and the political system and how that local political system may shape the different outcomes of global China. My case actually shows that even within one country, there are uneven results between mining and construction. The effect of China is very different in these two sectors, and I'm going to explain why. In mining, Chinese state capital turns out to be more negotiable, making more concessions to the Zambian government and its developmental agenda than global private capital. So in mining, my argument is that it is a benefit. It has a potential for Zambia to overcome historic obstacles, to turn itself from a mining country to a copper manufacturer. It has copper, but it has so far failed to use its copper to turn it into manufacture. However, in construction, it's the total opposite. Instead of being developmental, I found that Chinese state capital is predatory, as I have been showing my agreement with many of the speakers this morning. The way they do concessional loans, and you look at the details, and also the negotiation, the processes through which these concessional loans projects come about. And it's absolutely critical for people to try to understand what's happening, to go into the processes, to reconstruct the processes. And you'll find a lot of things that are totally surprising. The bargaining power of some of the weakest countries, the poorest country, don't underestimate them. Because if you go into the processes, you will see that these countries have agencies. They have politics. They have power to change, to channel, to ask China to do the things that, if they know what they want, which is the case in mining. So we need granular research, not grand theorizing. We need to get to the ground, get behind the processes, into the processes behind those policy papers. And so I'm going to use my 10 minutes to explain why and how it is the case that in mining, Chinese state capital is developmental, whereas in construction, it is predatory. Because we're studying capital, we need to know what these two types of capital or Chinese state capital wants. What is its interest? Capital, we always thought that we know what capital wants. It wants profit maximization. And it is true for the case for those companies that I study in mining that are London-listed companies. These are huge transnational mining companies, London-listed, and their goals are, seriously, is always profit maximization. I can give you the evidence if you want, but you just have to believe me now in the interest of time. But what about the Chinese? The Chinese want profit. Don't think that it's state-funded so they can sustain losses year after year. No. The companies that I studied, those managers, the CEOs told me that they have to stay above the red. They can't keep losing and expect handout from the state. So they need profit, but not maximize profit, but optimize profit. That's the term. They need some profit, but not maximum. But they want something else, and that's why I use the term encompassing accumulation. They want what? They want one thing, or two other things, profit, and the second thing is political influence. That's very clear. They have no qualm telling me, because I was at the meeting with the vice president with some of the very important Chinese delegations, so I can see how the elite talk to each other. And it's very clear that they want political influence. They want UN, Zambia's vote in the UN. They want diplomatic allies in Africa. And the third thing they want is raw material, strategic material at source. At source meaning that they could go to their own mines to get the copper instead of going through the international market to get copper, because they are anticipating that even one day the market may not work for them. Look at the trade war today. Look at embargo. So as a state, they were thinking that, it's not just money. So these two things, the important point about these two things is that they are not money, which means they can only get from sovereign states. And this is the bargaining power of even the poorest, militarily the weakest countries. That's as long as you are a sovereign power, and the Chinese state wants something beyond financial return, then you actually have some bargaining power. Only sovereign state can give, which is access of material at source and also diplomatic allies, influence. So with these encompassing interests, encompassing sets of interests, what I call encompassing accumulation, you can see the behavior of these two types of capital during crisis moments. So when I mentioned 2008, during the crisis, which paralyzed a country like Zambia, 1/3 of the mining workforce was let go during the 3 months, only 3 months, and it's 1/3 of them gone. And that is very destabilizing because miners actually earn the highest income among the working class, and they're the most organized, and they support many people. So these global private capital during the crisis just retrenched. The Chinese state capital, the Chinese state mine didn't. They keep production. They didn't fire anybody. They actually expanded production during the crisis period. And the reason was because they wanted actually the copper to keep the production going, because earning money when copper prices tank for them was not the only concern. They wanted the production to keep going because it's their mine. The second thing, they want the raw material, the ores itself. The second thing is they wanted to cultivate good relation with the Zambian government, and therefore, they want to help the government to stabilize the situation. So their reaction was very different, and it was very beneficial for the Zambian government to have this kind of capital. And the most important example to show that having encompassing accumulation helped Zambia to develop was China built something no foreign capital have ever agreed to build, and that is a special economic zone for Zambian to be able to turn the copper as ore into copper manufacture. And this is the zone that they have built. And okay, when the world saw the zone, they thought, well, it was imposed on the Zambian by the Chinese. But going behind the surface appearance of the zone to processes, the negotiations that actually resulted in the zone, I realized it was because the Zambians already had plans in their head for many, many years. They want a special economic zone, but never had the resources to build it. And so they were prepared. They know what they wanted from the Chinese. The Chinese came along and they negotiated. How do I know that it was their bargaining position, bargaining target? Because the Chinese at first only promised one zone. They were able to bargain for a second zone. It has nothing to do with copper, to develop other kinds of industry. So the lesson here is that if you know what you want from the Chinese, they are more negotiable than all these other global private capital, which only has profit in mind and would not do a project like this because it is unprofitable. In construction, the total opposite, because in construction, no Zambian elite I talk to, the directors, the permanent secretary of this and that ministries, including your counterpart in Zambia, the president, the vice president, nobody has any developmental vision for construction. They only said more is better because the Chinese may leave us, but they can't take away the bridges and the roads, which is true, but they forget the loans. The loans would help them win the next election, but in 20 years' time, it become a national problem. And the terms of the loans are very negative to the country. predatory. I don't have time. My chair is going to kick me out. So anyway, so I'm trying to, let me finish. Can I? 1 minute? Sure. We started late. Don't you remember? Anyway, so now I have a problem of what to tell you. Okay, so the lesson here is just by looking at the comparison between two sectors in one country, the key difference that make Chinese capital either developmental or predatory is local politics. China want influence and money and profit in these two sectors. The concessional loans bear higher interest rate than World Bank loans, no bidding, only Chinese companies, so forth, and so on and so forth. They want profits, but they also want to use the concessional loans to build patronage with African elites. And because in construction, the elites do not have any developmental vision beyond their own selfish electoral interest in the next election, that's why they can't leverage Chinese loans to the country's advantage, whereas in mining, all eyes are on mining. Not just the elite, it's not their goodwill, it's because they're pushed by the voters. They would be voted out of government if they don't stand up to the Chinese and get some advantages from foreign investment, which only the Chinese would build that zone for them. So I think the lesson here is that within one country, the sectoral difference here suggests that you may find domestic differences in the alliance, in the elite interest, in developmental strategy. All these would go into shaping the outcome of China's presence in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you.